Niccolò Machiavelli is arguably the most controversial philosopher in history. If Aristotle was known for his system of deductive logic, Plato for his examination of the abstract, and Socrates for his explication of the good life, then Machiavelli is known as the great defender of immorality, the man who gave intellectual justification for the deliberate abandonment of morals and ethics. Indeed, the term Machiavellianism is used to describe an antisocial personality trait, one of the three dark triad traits alongside narcissism and psychopathy. Machiavellianism is characterized by indifference to morality in the pursuit of self-interests. The test psychologists use for diagnosing this trait is to ask subjects how much they agree with various adapted quotes from Machiavelli's writing. In his most famous work, The Prince, Machiavelli makes several arguments that gave him such an infamous reputation. In a global competition for resources, says Machiavelli, any leader who refuses to act immorally will put his nation at a disadvantage to those leaders who are willing to act immorally. Therefore, leaders must be willing to demonstrate cruelty if they are to be effective. This cruelty, however, was not limited to foreign nations that the leader was at war with. Machiavelli argued that leaders must be willing to instill fear into their own subjects at home too. He posited that some leaders relied too heavily on admiration and gratitude for their power. In what is certainly the most frequently quoted passage of The Prince, Machiavelli addresses whether it is better to be feared or to be loved, writing, "The answer is that one would like to be both the one and the other, but because it is difficult to combine them, it is far safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Machiavelli justified this take by arguing that gratitude and admiration were transitive states dependent on external circumstances that at times were beyond the leader's control. Fear, on the other hand, can be ever present, and thus is the best guarantor that there is for a leader's perpetual power and personal security. Machiavelli further argues that it is important for leaders to lie to the general public frequently. Leaders should pretend to have virtues, but should be careful not to actually adhere to any of these virtues in their affairs, as to be virtuous would put one at a disadvantage to aspiring leaders that lacked ethics. Moreover, Machiavelli wrote that leaders should falsely create a perception that they keep their promises, but in private should abandon any commitment that disadvantages them. Given the nature of the advice provided, it should be no surprise that The Prince was carefully studied by some of the most notorious leaders in history, including Napoleon, Mussolini, and Stalin. So, why is it then that Machiavelli is not universally reviled? One would think that the author of the world's #1 self-help book for dictators and tyrants would suffer from a poor reputation, to say the least. And yet, many non-horrible people in history quite liked the guy. So, what are the defenses for him? The first, and most common, is that Machiavelli did not describe how things should be, but rather how things were. His writing, this argument goes, was not prescriptive, but was merely descriptive. In philosophy, this can lead to what's known as an is versus ought problem. The Scottish philosopher David Hume discussed this issue at length in his 18th century Treatise of Human Nature. Hume argued that many scholars falsely assume moral pretenses from mere observations. In other words, it is impossible to establish ethical norms from the existence of cause and effect phenomena. It would thereby follow that to attempt to extract a moral interpretation from Machiavelli's writings would be pointless, as he is simply offering an empirical analysis of what one must do if they seek to gain and hold power. Another defense of Machiavelli comes from consequentialist philosophers. Consequentialism is a school of thought that argues that the morality of an action can only be judged by the consequences of it, and not by the nature of the action itself. This contrasts with deontology, which, as best articulated by Immanuel Kant, argues for judging morality based on behavior and actions, and disregarding the consequences of said actions in the moral analysis. Machiavelli seemed to dislike the major philosophers of ancient Greece, who tended to advocate for virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a philosophical school that argues that morality cannot be discerned through the evaluation of actions or consequences, but only through the judgment of an individual's character and virtue. In other words, many of the ancient Greeks would argue that if a person has established themselves as a virtuous individual through the possession of several qualities described by Plato, then one can trust that their actions will tend to be morally correct, regardless of the consequences or the nature of the actions themselves. The consequentialists defend Machiavelli by arguing that he is ultimately advocating for the greatest possible good for the largest number of people. This premise, otherwise known as utilitarianism, posits that the ends justify the means so long as the ends are more beneficial on balance than the means are harmful. Machiavelli, in their view, was well-intended. He believed that safe, stable, and well-ordered societies that sought to maximize their own self-interests were ultimately beneficial to everyone, even if unsavory means were required to establish such societies. There is, of course, a third defense of Machiavelli. This one is by far the most interesting. According to several of his most prominent defenders, Machiavelli was a comedian. The Prince was one giant satire of tyranny. Could this actually be true? Well, believe it or not, there is a surprising amount of evidence that backs this theory. Indeed, Machiavelli's writings are filled with contradictions. In The Prince, he seems to be advocating for authoritarianism. Yet, in his second most famous work, Discourses on Livy, he appears to be making the case for liberalism and democracy. Moreover, Machiavelli wrote many novels, poems, and plays, most of which were comedies and satires. It is also worth noting here that Machiavelli was not just a writer, but was also an accomplished statesman, diplomat, and military strategist who played a pivotal role in the development of Renaissance Italy. So why was someone who was busy leading armies at war and negotiating treaties with kings also taking the time to write comedies? Was Machiavelli actually serious, or was he just the biggest troll in history? This is the first part in a series I'm doing on Machiavelli. I want to explore the man himself. What really motivated him? What were his influences? And what point was he actually trying to make with his writings? In order to answer these questions, we have to explore the history of the incredible city-state he called home, Florence. It experimented with some of the most fascinating systems of government ever conceived, including the practice of determining the city's leaders by randomly drawing names out of a list of citizens, and enacting 2-month term limits. In this series, you can expect to learn about the history of Renaissance Italy and its intersection with the life of Machiavelli. I will discuss the Medici, the Borgias, Savonarola, and I will also detail Machiavelli's interactions with figures including Leonardo da Vinci, Pope Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia, and King Louis XII. Oh, and if you ever played Assassin's Creed 2, this series might bring back some nostalgic memories from the game, which took place during this extraordinary period. We can only truly understand Machiavelli once we understand what was happening in the world around him. If this topic sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing, and leave a comment below if you have any thoughts on the subject. I need 1,000 subscribers for YouTube to monetize this channel, so if just 50 of you click that button, it would mean a lot to me. Also, please hit the thumbs up button, as this helps with the algorithm. Thank you so much for watching.